They said she was too big to love, too strong to be a woman, too much to ever belong. But on a scorching Wyoming afternoon in 1883, when Grace Dalton stood on that auction block, sold by her own blood for a bag of flour, one man saw something different. Jack Mercer didn't see a burden. He saw a woman worth fighting for. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The sun beat down on Sweetwater, Wyoming, with the kind of merciless heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the dirt roads. It was the summer of 1883, and the town square had transformed into a marketplace of flesh and desperation. Grace Dalton stood on the auction block, her wrists bound loosely with rough hemp rope, not because she was dangerous, but because tradition demanded it. The wood beneath her bare feet was hot enough to burn, but she didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only invited more cruelty. "Look at the size of her," someone shouted from the crowd, and laughter rippled through the assembly like wind through wheat. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the distant mountains that promised freedom she'd never known. She was 23 years old, stood nearly 6 feet tall, and had shoulders broader than most men in the territory. Her hands, calloused and strong from years of labor, hung at her sides like anchors. She wore a dress that had been let out 3 times, the seams straining across her back, the hem falling several inches too short to be decent. Her dark hair, thick and unruly, had been pulled back with a strip of cloth, but strands escaped to frame a face that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion etched into every line. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man named Silas Brennan, wiped sweat from his brow and consulted his notes. "Grace Dalton," he announced, his voice carrying across the square. 23 years of age, strong as an ox. Can plow a field, milk 20 cows before breakfast, and carry a full-grown hog over her shoulder." He paused for effect, letting his gaze sweep the crowd. "But as you can see, she's considerable in size. Her own family couldn't afford to feed her anymore, so here she is, indentured servitude. 7 years of labor to whoever makes the best offer." "7 years?" a woman's voice called out. "Who'd want to feed that for 7 years?" More laughter. Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't look down. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Her uncle, Vernon Dalton, stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't have the decency to look ashamed. When Grace's parents had died of fever 2 winters ago, Vernon had inherited their small farm, along with the responsibility of caring for their only daughter. For a while, he'd put her to work, and Grace had worked harder than any 3 men combined. She'd cleared fields, mended fences, tended livestock, and kept his house running while his own wife lay in bed complaining of various ailments both real and imagined. But when the drought came and the crops failed, Vernon had made his choice. The horses could be sold, the pigs could be sold. And Grace ate too much and took up too much space. She had to go. "Starting bid," Silas called out, "is 1 bag of quality flour and provisions for the winter months." The crowd murmured. A bag of flour was worth something, but not much. It was an insult disguised as an offer, and everyone knew it. "I'll take her," rasped a voice from the left. Grace's eyes flicked toward the sound and found old Amos Crawford, a widower with a reputation for working his servants until they collapsed. He had a farm 20 miles north, and rumor said his last 3 hired hands had fled in the night, rather than endure another season under his brutality. "1 bag of flour. I need someone to work my North 40. "1 bag of flour," Silas repeated. "Do I hear?" "2 bags," interrupted another voice. This one belonged to Marcus Riley, who owned the freight company. "And I'll throw in a side of bacon. I need someone to load wagons." Grace's stomach turned. She'd seen the way Riley looked at his female workers, the way his hands lingered too long when he passed them their wages. 7 years under his employment would be 7 years of fighting off more than just hard labor. 2 bags of flour and a side of bacon. Silas's eyes gleamed. "Now we're talking. Anyone else?" The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. They wanted entertainment, but actually bidding on a human being, even one they considered oversized and unmarriageable, required a certain moral flexibility that not everyone possessed. Grace scanned the faces before her. Women she'd helped during difficult births, their faces now turned away in embarrassment. Men whose children she'd pulled from the river, who now studied their boots rather than meet her gaze. The baker's wife, who'd once praised Grace's bread as the finest in the territory, now whispered behind her hand to her neighbor. This was what she'd been reduced to, not even worth her own family's protection, not even worth the decency of silence. 2 bags and bacon going once, Silas called, his voice rising with theatrical flair. Going twice. Hold on. The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and quiet, but carrying a weight that made people turn. Grace looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw the crowd parting like the Red Sea. A man walked forward with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. He was tall, perhaps as tall as Grace herself, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard work and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore dusty trail clothes, a faded blue shirt, dark pants tucked into worn boots, and a hat that had seen better days. His jaw was covered in several days' worth of stubble, and his eyes, the color of storm clouds, remained fixed on Grace with an intensity that made her breath catch. He walked right up to the auction block without acknowledging anyone else, his spurs making a soft chiming sound with each step. "What's your name?" he asked Grace directly, completely ignoring Silas and the established protocol of the auction. Grace blinked, surprised by the direct address. "Grace?" she managed, her voice rough from disuse. "Grace Dalton." He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. Then he turned to Silas. "What's she being sold for?" Silas puffed up, offended by the man's casual dismissal of his authority. "This is an auction, friend. Current bid is 2 bags of flour and—" "I asked what she's being sold for," the man repeated, his tone unchanged, but somehow colder. "Not what she's being bid at. What did her family get for putting her on this block?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the square. Vernon Dalton shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly very interested in a loose thread on his jacket. That's between the family and—" Silas began. 1 bag of flour," Grace said clearly, her eyes locked on the stranger, "and a promise they wouldn't starve this winter." Something flickered across the man's face, anger perhaps, or disgust, but it was gone so quickly Grace couldn't be sure. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. Without counting, he tossed it to Silas, who fumbled the catch and nearly dropped it. "That's 3 months' wages," the stranger said. "More than enough to cover whatever debts you think she owes." He turned back to Grace, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that she'd almost forgotten existed. Respect. "I'm Jack Mercer. I have a ranch about 30 miles west of here. I need help, and I pay fair. But I'm not buying you like livestock. If you come with me, it's because you choose to. And if you choose to leave at any point, I'll bring you to whatever town you want and give you enough money for a fresh start." Grace stared at him, searching for the trap. There was always a trap. Men didn't make offers like this without expecting something in return. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why me?" Jack Mercer didn't smile, but something softened around his eyes. "Because everyone else here is looking at you like you're too much, too big, too strong, too something." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd, and Grace saw more than a few people flinch under that gray stare. "I lost my wife and daughter 3 years ago. Fever took them both in the same week. Been running that ranch alone ever since, and it's breaking me down piece by piece. I need someone strong enough to handle the work. Someone who won't give up when things get hard. Someone who knows what it means to survive." He looked back at Grace, and this time she saw the exhaustion in his face, the grief worn into the lines around his mouth, the loneliness that mirrored her own. "You look like a survivor to me." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. And because no one had acknowledged that truth before, that simply making it to this point, standing on this block with her dignity intact, was an act of survival. "What about the 7 years?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are no 7 years," Jack said firmly. "You work for me. I pay you fair wages. Same as I'd pay any ranch hand. You save up enough to leave, you leave. You decide you hate ranch life, you leave. You find a better situation, you leave. The choice is always yours." He held out his hand to her. "So what do you say, Grace Dalton? You want to come work for a lonely cowboy who treats his help like human beings?" Grace looked at his extended hand, then back at his face. She'd spent her entire life being told she was too much, too big, too strong, too difficult, too expensive to maintain. She'd been treated like a burden, a problem to be solved, a mouth that ate too much and took up too much space. But Jack Mercer was looking at her like she was exactly what he needed, like her size was an asset, not a flaw, like her strength was valuable, not shameful. She reached out and placed her calloused hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers with a firm, warm grip. "I'll work for you," she said, her voice stronger now, "for fair wages and the right to leave when I choose." "Deal," Jack said simply. He turned to Silas and gestured at Grace's bound wrists. "Cut her loose." Silas sputtered. "Now hold on a minute, there are procedures." "Cut her loose," Jack repeated, his voice dropping into a register that suggested this was not a request. "Or I'll do it myself and send you the bill for my time." Silas's hands shook as he fumbled with the rope, finally cutting through it with a knife that had seen better days. The hemp fell away, and Grace rubbed her wrists, feeling the blood flow back into her hands. Jack stepped up onto the block beside her, an action that made Silas scuttle backward in alarm, and in one smooth motion, he swept Grace up into his arms. The crowd gasped. Grace gasped too, instinctively grabbing onto his shoulders as the world tilted. She was not a small woman, and no one had picked her up since she was a child. The sheer impossibility of it made her dizzy. Jack adjusted his grip, settling her weight against his chest as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain. He looked down at her, and for the first time since she'd seen him, the corner of his mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. "You're just right for my arms," he said, loud enough for the entire square to hear. Then he turned and walked through the stunned crowd, carrying Grace away from the auction block, away from her uncle's shame, away from the mockery and the humiliation. Behind them, the crowd erupted into confused chatter, but Grace didn't hear it. She was too focused on the steady rhythm of Jack's breathing, the security of his grip, the way he navigated the street like she weighed nothing at all. "You can put me down," she said after a moment, her voice strange in her own ears. "I can walk." "I know you can," Jack replied, not breaking stride. "But these people need to see something different than what they expect. Let them see that someone values you. Let them remember this moment the next time they think about treating another person like livestock." Grace fell silent, letting herself be carried through Sweetwater's main street. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Children pointed. Women clutched their shawls and whispered behind their hands. Men frowned and muttered among themselves. And Grace, for the first time in as long as she could remember, felt safe. Jack carried her all the way to the edge of town where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 draft horses that looked well cared for and strong. A sorrel mare was tied to the back of the wagon, her coat gleaming in the sun. Only when they reached the wagon did Jack carefully set Grace down, making sure she had her feet under her before releasing his hold. "Thank you," Grace said, the words feeling inadequate for what had just happened. Jack nodded, then gestured to the wagon bed. "There's a canteen of water and some bread and cheese under the seat. Help yourself. It's a 4-hour drive to the ranch, and we should get moving before the heat gets worse." Grace climbed into the wagon, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and shock. As Jack moved around to the driver's side, she caught sight of movement from the corner of her eye. Vernon Dalton stood at the edge of the crowd, watching them prepare to leave. For just a moment, his eyes met Grace's, and she saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his face. But then he turned away, disappearing into the crowd, and Grace knew she'd never see him again. Good riddance. Jack climbed up beside her and took the reins, making a soft clicking sound with his tongue that set the horses into motion. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking, and Sweetwater began to fall away behind them. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the clopping of hooves, and the occasional whistle of wind across the plains. Grace ate the bread and cheese Jack had provided, savoring every bite. It was good bread, made with real butter, and the cheese was sharp and crumbly, better food than she'd had in months. "Your ranch," she finally said, breaking the silence. "What kind of operation is it?" "Cattle, mostly," Jack replied, his eyes on the road ahead. "Some horses. I've got about 200 head right now, down from 500 before—" He trailed off, and Grace understood. Before his wife and daughter died. Before he had to run everything alone. 200 head is a lot for one person, she observed. "It is," Jack agreed. I've been selling off stock, trying to keep the herd manageable. But I'm losing money, losing ground. Another year alone and I'd have to sell the whole thing, move to town, find work as a common laborer. He glanced at her. I'm not going to lie to you, Grace. The work is hard. Dawn to dusk most days, longer during calving season. The house needs repairs, the barn needs repairs. The fences are in terrible shape. I'm one bad winter away from losing everything. Then why offer me fair wages? Grace asked. Why not take advantage of the indenture? 7 years of free labor would save your ranch. Jack's jaw tightened. Because I've seen what desperation does to people's morality. I watched good men turn cruel when the drought came. Watched them justify all kinds of evil in the name of survival. He shook his head. My father taught me that how you treat people when you have power over them defines who you are. I'm not going to become the kind of man who owns another person, regardless of what the law says I can do. Grace studied his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way he held the reins with relaxed competence. You're an unusual man, Jack Mercer. Maybe, he allowed. Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually shifting from the dusty town streets to rolling prairie dotted with sage and buffalo grass. The mountains in the distance grew larger, their peaks still white with last winter's snow. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals, and once they saw a small herd of pronghorn antelope bounding across the plains in the distance. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack pointed ahead. There, that's home. Grace followed his gesture and saw a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley where a creek cut through the land. From this distance, she could make out a house, a barn, several corrals, and what looked like a bunkhouse. It was modest by ranching standards, no grand house or elaborate outbuildings, but it looked solid and well-maintained despite Jack's claims of disrepair. It's beautiful, Grace said softly, and meant it. After years of living in her uncle's cramped, mean little farmhouse, the idea of this open space felt like a dream. Jack smiled, a real smile this time. Wait until you see it up close, might change your mind. But when they rolled into the ranch yard 20 minutes later, Grace didn't change her mind. Yes, the fences needed mending. Yes, the barn door hung at a slight angle. Yes, the house could use a fresh coat of paint. But underneath the signs of one man's struggle to maintain everything alone, she saw good bones, strong foundations, a place built with care and meant to last. Jack helped her down from the wagon, just offering his hand this time, not sweeping her up, and led her toward the house. Bunkhouse is over there, he said, gesturing to a low building near the barn. But I figure you might prefer the spare room in the house. Used to be, He cleared his throat. It's got a bed and a washstand. Window faces east so you'll get morning sun. Door has a lock on the inside. The last detail was not lost on Grace. He was making sure she knew she'd have privacy and security. Thank you, she said. The house was simple but comfortable. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A hallway led to what Grace assumed were the bedrooms. Everything was clean but showed signs of bachelor living, dishes stacked haphazardly, a shirt draped over a chair, a book left open on the table. Jack led her to a room at the end of the hall and pushed open the door. It was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and that promised east-facing window. The bed was stripped bare, but a folded set of linen sat on top of the mattress. I'll, let you get settled, Jack said, suddenly awkward. There's a pump outside for water. Outhouse is behind the barn. I'll get some supper started in about an hour if you want to freshen up. After he left, Grace closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened today. This morning she'd woken in her uncle's house, knowing she'd be sold before sunset. She'd prepared herself for cruelty, for humiliation, for a life of servitude under someone who would see her as less than human. Instead, she'd been carried away by a stranger who treated her with more dignity in one afternoon than her own family had shown in years. A stranger who'd looked at her and seen value instead of burden, who'd called her just right when everyone else called her too much. Grace lay back on the bare mattress and stared at the ceiling, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness or despair. They were tears of relief, of hope, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change for the better. Outside, she heard Jack moving around, the sound of him unhitching the horses and leading them to the barn. The ranch was coming alive around her with evening sounds. Cattle lowing in the distance, a rooster crowing despite the time of day, the creak of a windmill turning in the breeze. This was her home now, at least for a while, at least until she saved enough to figure out what came next. Grace sat up, brushed the tears away, and began making her bed. The linens were worn but clean, and they smelled of soap and sunshine. As she worked, tucking the corners with the precision of someone who'd made 1,000 beds, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done in years. Tomorrow would bring hard work. She had no illusions about that. But for tonight, she was safe. She was fed. She was valued. For tonight, that was more than enough. When Grace emerged from her room an hour later, having washed her face and hands and attempted to tame her wild hair, she found Jack in the kitchen working over the stove. He changed into a clean shirt and shaved, though he'd missed a spot near his left ear. The table was set for two, and the smell of frying bacon and eggs filled the small house. "Hope you're hungry," Jack said without turning around. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage breakfast foods any time of day." "I'm hungry," Grace admitted, sliding into one of the chairs. "I'm always hungry." Jack glanced over his shoulder, and something in his expression made Grace brace herself for commentary about her appetite, about how much she ate, about how expensive she was to maintain, but instead, he just nodded. "Good. Woman your size, doing the kind of work I'll be asking, you'll need to eat well. No point in having strong help if they're too underfed to use that strength." Grace felt something tight in her chest loosen. "That's not what most people say." "Most people are fools," Jack replied, sliding a plate in front of her that was heaped with eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and thick slices of bread. "Eat up. Tomorrow we've got a full day ahead of us, and I want to show you around the property. See where you think you can help most." They ate in companionable silence, and Grace tried not to inhale her food despite her hunger. But Jack was focused on his own plate, not judging her portions or counting her bites, and gradually she relaxed enough to simply enjoy the meal. After dinner, Jack showed her where everything was: the pump, the outhouse, the henhouse, the barn. As darkness fell over the ranch, they stood in the yard looking up at a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible. "I know today was difficult," Jack said quietly, "and I know trust doesn't come easy, especially after what you've been through. But I meant what I said, Grace. You're safe here. You're valued here. And if I ever do anything to make you feel otherwise, you tell me straight. I don't want to be the kind of man who forgets what it means to be decent." Grace looked at this stranger who'd bought her freedom and offered her a future. "I believe you," she said, and discovered she meant it. Jack nodded, satisfied. "Get some rest. Sun comes up early and ranching waits for no one." As Grace made her way back to her room, she passed a small table in the hallway that held a framed photograph. She paused, studying it in the dim lamplight. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile sat holding a little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old. Behind them stood a younger version of Jack, his arm around his wife's shoulders, his face open and happy in a way Grace hadn't yet seen in person. She understood then, looking at that photograph, that Jack Mercer was as much a survivor as she was, that they'd both lost everything and were both trying to build something new from the wreckage. Maybe that's why he'd chosen her, not despite her brokenness, but because he recognized it in himself. Grace touched her fingers gently to the frame, a gesture of acknowledgement, then continued to her room. She locked the door, not because she didn't trust Jack, but because having the power to lock it was a luxury she'd almost forgotten, and changed into the worn nightgown that was her only sleepwear. As she lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, Grace thought about the future, about what it might mean to stay here, to work this land, to maybe build something resembling a life. She thought about Jack's words at the auction, "You're just right for my arms." No one had ever called her just right before. Too big, yes, too much, always. But just right? Never. Maybe that was about to change. As sleep finally claimed her, Grace's last conscious thought was simple but profound. "I'm going to make this work. Whatever it takes, I'm going to prove I belong here. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. Dawn came to the Mercer Ranch with the kind of gentle insistence that made sleep impossible to hold on to. Grace woke to golden light streaming through her east-facing window, painting stripes across the worn quilt she'd buried herself under. For a moment, still caught in the web between dreams and waking, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned in a rush. The auction block, Jack's arms carrying her away, the promise of fair wages and freedom, and she sat up so quickly her head spun. The house was already alive with sound. She could hear Jack moving around in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and the hiss of water being poured. The smell of coffee drifted under her door, rich and dark, and completely unlike the chicory substitute her uncle had rationed out like gold. Grace dressed quickly in the same worn dress from yesterday. It was the only one she owned, and twisted her hair back with practiced efficiency. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a woman she barely recognized. The hunted look in her eyes had softened somehow, overnight, replaced by something that might have been cautious hope. When she emerged from her room, she found Jack standing at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she was struck again by how different he looked in the morning light, younger somehow, despite the gray threading through his dark hair. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Coffee's ready, and I've got oatmeal cooking. Figured we'd need something substantial before we start the day." Grace poured herself a cup of coffee, cradling the warm mug between her palms. "What time did you get up?" 4:30, Jack replied, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Stock doesn't care if you're tired. They need feeding, checking, tending." He ladled oatmeal into 2 bowls and carried them to the table. "But I let you sleep. Figured after yesterday, you'd earned it." They ate quickly, efficiently, the way people did when work was waiting. Jack outlined his plan for the day between bites: check the cattle in the north pasture, mend the fence line along the creek, assess the barn's structural issues, and somehow fit in mucking out the stalls that had been neglected for too long. "I'll do the stalls," Grace offered immediately, "and anything else that needs muscle more than skill." Jack studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You ever worked with cattle before?" "Some. My father had a small herd before he died. I know enough not to spook them, and I know which end bites." She managed a small smile. "Beyond that, I'm better suited to heavy lifting than delicate work." "We'll see about that," Jack said, but not unkindly. "I found most people can learn anything if they're willing to try. Come on, let's get you properly introduced to this place." The ranch looked different in daylight, both better and worse than Grace's first impression. The bones were solid, as she'd thought. The barn was well built, the corrals sturdy, the house positioned to take advantage of the creek's curve for water access. But everywhere she looked, she saw the evidence of one man fighting a losing battle against time and nature. Fence posts leaned at drunken angles. The barn's roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away. Weeds choked the kitchen garden that must have once been someone's pride. Jack's wife, Grace thought. She would have tended that garden. They walked the property together, Jack pointing out boundaries and hazards, explaining his system for rotating pastures and managing water rights. Grace listened intently, filing away every detail. This wasn't just a job. It was her future, at least for now, and she intended to learn it inside and out. The cattle were in the north pasture, as Jack had said, a mixed herd of about 200 ranging from yearlings to mature cows with calves at their sides. They were good stock. Grace could see that even with her limited experience. Healthy coats, clear eyes, no signs of disease or neglect. "They look well cared for," she observed. "They're easier than fences," Jack replied with a hint of dark humor. "Can't let the stock suffer just because I'm one man doing the work of 5. Grace watched him as he counted heads, checking for any animals that might be injured or ill. He moved with quiet confidence, reading the herd's behavior like some men read newspapers. This was a man who knew his business, who'd been shaped by this land and this life. The grief that had driven him to carry on alone for 3 years hadn't broken his competence, just his spirit. "Jack," she said carefully, waiting until he'd finished his count. "I know you said fair wages, but you never said how much." He turned to face her fully, and she saw him calculating, weighing what was fair against what he could afford. $30 a month, he finally said, plus room and board. Same as I'd pay a ranch hand, maybe a bit more considering the state of things. I can't match what the big spreads pay, but it's honest money. $30 a month. Grace's mind raced through the arithmetic. In a year, she could save enough to buy land of her own, or set herself up in a town somewhere with a trade. In 2 years, she could do almost anything. It was more money than she'd ever had access to in her life. That's generous, she said. It's fair, Jack corrected. There's a difference. He paused, then added, My father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he can take, but by what he's willing to give. I'm trying to live by that. They spent the rest of the morning working side by side. Jack showed Grace how to check the cattle for signs of disease, how to identify which animals were ready for market, how to spot a cow that was about to calve. Then they moved to the fence line, and Grace got her first real test. The posts were weathered and loose, many of them rotted at the base where water had pooled. Jack had replacement posts already cut and waiting, but they were heavy, 8-foot lengths of pine that weighed close to 60 pounds each. He grabbed one and hefted it onto his shoulder with visible effort, preparing to carry it to the first gap in the fence. Grace picked up 2. Jack stopped mid-stride and turned, watching as she balanced one post on each shoulder with the kind of ease that came from years of being told to do the work of multiple people. You're going to hurt yourself, he said, but there was no heat in it, just concern. I've carried heavier, Grace replied honestly. My uncle used to have me haul feed sacks, 100-pound bags, 2 at a time, from the barn to the livestock pens. These are nothing. Something shifted in Jack's expression, a flicker of anger that wasn't directed at her. Your uncle was a fool. Yes, Grace agreed simply. He was. But he taught me what I could do, even if he didn't mean it as a kindness. They worked through the morning, replacing posts and stringing new wire. Grace's hands remembered the work, the bite of the wire cutters, the rhythm of driving posts into hard ground, the satisfaction of seeing a sagging fence line pulled straight and true. Jack worked beside her, and she noticed he didn't try to do everything himself once he realized she was capable. He let her take the heavy work, and in return he handled the detail work that required finesse, splicing wire, setting tension just right, making sure everything was secure. It was partnership, Grace realized, not master and servant, not employer and laborer keeping careful distance, just 2 people working toward a common goal. By noon, the sun was merciless overhead, and both of them were soaked with sweat. Jack called a break, and they retreated to the shade of a cottonwood that grew near the creek. He'd brought water and some leftover biscuits from breakfast, and they ate in comfortable silence, watching the cattle graze in the distance. You're stronger than any man I've worked with, Jack said eventually, his tone conversational. Including myself. Grace tensed, waiting for the rest of it. The judgment. The suggestion that strength like hers was unnatural in a woman, something to be ashamed of. But Jack just took another drink of water and added, I'm grateful for it. This place was dying, Grace, slowly but surely. I couldn't keep up with everything that needed doing. But with you here, he gestured at the fence line they'd repaired, already looking better than it had in years. Maybe we've got a fighting chance. We, Grace repeated softly. If you're willing, Jack said, meeting her eyes. I know you've got no reason to trust me yet, no reason to think of this place as yours. But if you're willing to invest in it, I'm willing to share the success. You stay 2 years, work like you have been, and I'll give you a percentage of the profits when we sell stock. Not much, but enough to matter. Grace stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering. Partnership. Not just employment, but actual stake in the outcome. Why would you do that? Because it's fair, Jack said again, with the patience of someone repeating a fundamental truth. Because you're putting in the work, and you should see the rewards. And because, he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, because I've been alone too long, and I'm tired of thinking of this place as just mine. It's easier to keep going when you've got someone to build toward something with. Grace felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she'd built to protect herself from hope. I'll stay, she heard herself say. As long as you'll have me, I'll stay and work and help you make this place what it should be. Jack nodded, and for a moment she thought she saw relief flash across his face. Then we've got a deal, partners in this venture even if I'm the one who owns the deed. They shook hands there under the cottonwood, and Grace felt the calluses on his palm match up with the calluses on hers, the rough places worn smooth by work, by survival, by refusing to give up. The afternoon brought new challenges. The barn, as Jack had warned, was in worse shape than it looked from the outside. Several of the support beams had started to rot, and the loft floor was sagging dangerously in one corner. They spent hours assessing the damage, Jack explaining what needed to be done, while Grace made mental notes. "This is going to take weeks," Jack admitted, running his hand along a beam that crumbled at his touch. "Maybe months if we do it right. And we need to do it right, or we'll lose the whole structure come next winter." "Then we start today," Grace said practically. "What needs to happen first?" Jack looked at her with something like admiration. "We need to shore up these beams before they collapse completely. That means jacking up the loft, replacing the rotted wood, and hoping the whole thing doesn't come down on our heads in the process." "Sounds dangerous." "It is." Jack didn't sugarcoat it. "If you'd rather work on something else, I'd rather work on what needs doing most," Grace interrupted. "If this barn falls, where will the stock shelter in winter? Where will we store feed and tack? This is the spine of the whole operation. We fix this first." Jack smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look like the man in the photograph with his wife and daughter. "You think like a rancher," he said. "Not many people see the big picture like that." "I've had a lot of practice seeing what needs doing and figuring out how to do it with nothing," Grace replied. "This is just a bigger version of the same problem." They worked until the light failed, until Grace's muscles screamed and her hands were raw despite their calluses. Jack finally called a halt when he nearly dropped a hammer on his own foot, exhaustion making him clumsy. "That's enough," he declared. "We're no good to this place if we kill ourselves in the first week. Let's get cleaned up and fed." Dinner that night was simple, beans and cornbread and more of that good coffee, but Grace had never enjoyed a meal more. Every muscle in her body ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that came from useful work, from building instead of just surviving. "Tomorrow," Jack said as they cleaned up the dishes together, "I thought we'd ride out to the west pasture. I've got some horses out there that need checking, and I want to see how you ride." "I ride well enough," Grace said carefully, "though I'm probably harder on a horse than most, given my size." Jack snorted. "I've got a mare that can carry me and a full elk carcass down a mountain. She'll handle you just fine. Besides," he added with a glance at her, "I've been thinking about that. Your size, I mean." Grace's stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought, the real opinion, the truth under the kind words. But Jack just said, "I've been building things for my size my whole life. Chairs that don't creak, beds that don't break, doorways I don't have to duck through. Never occurred to me that someone else might need the same considerations." He gestured around the house. "These next few weeks, while we're doing repairs anyway, I want you to tell me what doesn't work for you. What's too small, too weak, too uncomfortable? We'll fix it. Make this place fit the people living in it instead of the other way around." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," Jack said firmly. "You're going to be here at least 2 years, hopefully longer. You should be comfortable. You should have furniture that fits you, spaces that work for your body instead of against it. It's just practical." Practical. As if caring about her comfort was no different than maintaining fence lines or shoeing horses. As if she was worth the effort simply because she was there, living and working and being human. Grace turned away, busying herself with wiping down the table so he wouldn't see how much his words affected her. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough. "For all of it. For today. For this chance. For treating me like a person?" Jack supplied gently. "Grace, that's not something you need to thank me for. That's just basic decency." "You'd be surprised how rare basic decency is," Grace replied, setting down the cloth and finally meeting his eyes, "especially for someone like me." Jack's expression hardened. "Then the world's full of fools, and they're missing out on knowing someone remarkable." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he might comment on the weather, but Grace felt the sincerity behind every word. They said goodnight shortly after, both of them exhausted. But as Grace lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the ranch settle around her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope. That was too fragile, too easily broken. This was something stronger, determination, purpose. The sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both grueling and satisfying. Grace rose with the sun, worked alongside Jack until her body screamed for rest, ate meals that actually filled her stomach, and fell into bed so tired she barely remembered laying down. The work was endless. There was always another fence to mend, another stall to clean, another project that had been put off for too long. But every evening, when she and Jack surveyed what they'd accomplished, Grace could see the ranch coming back to life. The barn's support beams got replaced one by one, a careful process that involved Jack's and prayers, and Jack muttering about structural integrity. Grace held boards in place while he hammered, her strength allowing them to work twice as fast as if he'd been alone. The fence lines got walked and repaired section by section. The cattle got checked daily, and Grace learned to recognize individual animals by their markings and temperament. But it wasn't just the ranch that was changing. Grace was changing too. 3 weeks after arriving at the Mercer Ranch, Grace realized she was laughing. Actually laughing. The sound startling her because she couldn't remember the last time she'd done it. They were working in the barn, trying to convince a stubborn cow to move into a different stall, and the beast had somehow managed to step on Jack's foot, sit on a bucket, and knock over a pile of carefully stacked feed sacks in the span of 30 seconds. Jack had looked at the chaos, looked at the cow, and said with perfect deadpan delivery, "I see you've met Matilda. She's our resident agent of destruction." And Grace had laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a real, full-bellied laugh that echoed off the barn walls. Jack had grinned at her, clearly pleased with himself, and even Matilda had seemed to settle down, as if satisfied with the mayhem she'd created. "She likes you," Jack observed, once they'd finally gotten the cow settled. "Matilda doesn't usually warm up to people this fast." "Maybe she recognizes a fellow troublemaker," Grace replied, still smiling. "Or maybe," Jack said thoughtfully, "she recognizes someone who isn't afraid of her. Animals know the difference." Grace had thought about that comment for days afterward. Wasn't afraid. When had she stopped being afraid? Not of the work or the animals, or even the possibility of failure. When had she stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Jack to reveal some hidden cruelty, for this new life to turn out to be just another version of her old suffering? She didn't have an answer, but the absence of that constant fear felt like shedding a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. A month into her employment, the first test of their partnership came in the form of Randall Hayes. Grace was working in the barn, replacing rotted boards in the stalls, when she heard horses approaching. She straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, and walked to the barn door to see 3 men riding into the yard. The leader was well-dressed by local standards. Tailored clothes, expensive saddle, a horse that had probably cost more than most families made in a year. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome if not for the meanness around the eyes and mouth. Jack emerged from the house, and Grace saw his entire body tense. This was not a friendly visit. "Randall," Jack said flatly, the single word carrying enough ice to freeze fire. "Jack." The well-dressed man dismounted, his 2 companions staying on their horses. "Heard you finally broke down and hired help. Couldn't keep this place running on pride alone, could you?" "I hired a partner," Jack corrected, his voice carefully neutral. "What do you want, Randall? I'm busy." Randall's eyes found Grace standing in the barn doorway, and his expression shifted to something calculating. "That the help? Heard you bought yourself a woman at auction over in Sweetwater. Must have been desperate." Grace felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with worse than this. She could handle a rich man with a mean mouth. Jack, however, took a step forward, his hand dropping to his side in a way that made Grace think he might be armed. "Watch your mouth, Hayes. Grace works here, same as any ranch hand. What she's not is any of your business." "Everything in this valley is my business," Randall replied smoothly. "I own most of it, in case you forgot, including the water rights to that creek of yours." Grace saw Jack's jaw clench. "Those rights were settled years ago. The creek runs through my property. I've got legal access." "Legal access that needs to be renewed every 5 years, Randall said, pulling a document from his jacket. "And according to the county records, your renewal was due last month, which you missed, being so busy running this place alone." He smiled, and it was the smile of a cat with a mouse. "Without that renewal, you're using water you have no legal right to. That's theft, Jack. Could lose your whole operation over something like that. Grace watched Jack's face drain of color. Without water, the ranch was worthless. The cattle couldn't survive without the creek. Everything they'd worked to build would collapse. The renewal office never sent notice, Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. They always send notice. Not my problem if the mail gets lost, Randall replied with false sympathy. But I'll tell you what, I'm a reasonable man. I'll reinstate your water rights. All you have to do is sell me this ranch. I'll give you a fair price, enough to set yourself up in town, maybe buy a little shop somewhere. It's better than you deserve, considering you've been stealing water for a month. Grace felt rage boiling in her chest. This wasn't about water rights or legal technicalities. This was about a rich man seeing an opportunity to take what he wanted from someone who couldn't fight back. How much? She heard herself ask, stepping out of the barn. All eyes turned to her. Randall looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. Excuse me? The renewal, Grace said, walking forward to stand beside Jack. How much does it cost to renew water rights for 5 years? Randall laughed, a sound like gravel scraping glass. What's it to you, woman? This is between men. I'm a partner in this ranch, Grace said, lifting her chin. Which makes it my business, too. So how much? $50, Randall admitted reluctantly. But the deadline's passed, so now there's penalties, late fees. $100 total? Grace pressed. About that, yes, but then we'll pay it, Grace said firmly. Today. Jack, you ride into town and file the renewal. I'll stay here and keep working. Problem solved. Randall's face darkened. You can't just... The deadline has passed. There are procedures, and I'm sure the county clerk will be happy to accept the fee and process the paperwork, Grace continued, her voice sweet as honey and twice as dangerous. Unless there's some reason he wouldn't, some reason the county wouldn't want legitimate fees paid? She let the implication hang in the air. If Randall had somehow interfered with the renewal notice, if he had deliberately tried to sabotage Jack's legal standing, that was corruption. And even in the territories, corruption could be prosecuted. Randall's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake, woman. Both of you. I could buy this place 10 times over. I have resources, connections. And we have each other, Jack said, finding his voice again. He glanced at Grace, and she saw gratitude and something else in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of an equal. Thank you, Randall, for bringing this to our attention. We'll handle it from here. Don't let us keep you. It was a dismissal, clear and final. Randall stood there for a moment, his face cycling through shades of red, before mounting his horse with stiff dignity. This isn't over, he said. You're barely hanging on, Mercer. One bad winter, one drought, one piece of bad luck, and you'll lose everything. And when that happens, I'll be there to pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar. Then I guess we'd better not have any bad luck, Grace said calmly, meeting his glare without flinching. Randall yanked his horse's head around and spurred it toward the road, his men following. They watched until the dust settled, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into distance. Then Jack turned to Grace, his expression somewhere between shocked and impressed. Where did you learn to face down a man like that? Grace shrugged, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. My uncle owed money to half the territory. I got used to standing between him and the consequences. Besides, she added with a slight smile, he was just a bully in fancy clothes. Bullies are all the same underneath. They count on you being too scared to call them out. Jack shook his head slowly. Grace Dalton, you are full of surprises. Then his expression sobered. But I don't have $100. I've got maybe 60 in the house, saved for winter supplies. I can't... I have it, Grace interrupted. My wages from this month, plus what I've saved. It's exactly $100. Grace, no, that's your money, your future. I can't ask you to... You're not asking, Grace said firmly. I'm offering. We're partners, remember? If this ranch fails, I lose too. But if we save it, we both win. That's what partnership means. Jack looked at her for a long moment, and Grace saw him struggling with pride, with the instinct to handle his own problems, with the vulnerability of accepting help. Finally, he nodded. Then we ride into town together, file the paperwork together. Because you're right, we're partners. And partners don't leave each other to handle the hard parts alone. They rode out within the hour, Grace on the sturdy mare Jack had promised, and Jack on his own gelding. The journey to town took most of the afternoon, and they used the time to talk through what had just happened. Randall's had his eye on this place for years, Jack explained as they rode. He owns the 3 ranches that border mine, bought them all up during the drought when people were desperate to sell. He's trying to create some kind of empire out here, control the whole valley. My property sits right in the middle of his holdings. It drives him crazy that I won't sell. Why does he want it so badly? Grace asked. Water, mostly. My creek feeds into the main river that runs through all his properties. If he controlled my land, he'd control the water supply for the whole valley. He could charge whatever he wanted for water access, drive out any competition. Jack's voice hardened. After my wife and daughter died, he offered to buy the place, said I didn't need it anymore, that it was too much for one man, offered maybe half what it was worth. When I refused, he's been looking for ways to pressure me ever since. Grace felt cold understanding settle over her. He deliberately intercepted your renewal notice. Probably, Jack agreed. Can't prove it, but yes. He's got friends in the county offices, people he's paid off or helped in the past. Would have been easy enough to make sure I never got the notification. That's illegal. It's politics, Jack corrected bitterly. And out here, if you've got enough money, the law works for you instead of against you. They reached town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The county clerk's office was closed, but Jack knew where the clerk lived and knocked on his door with the kind of determination that suggested he wasn't leaving without what he came for. The clerk, a nervous man named Peter Simmons, opened the door looking annoyed until he saw Jack's expression. Mr. Mercer, I was just sitting down to supper. We need to file a water rights renewal, Jack said, not quite pushing past him, but making it clear he wasn't going to be dismissed. Tonight. Tonight. But the office is closed and the deadline is something we're willing to pay penalties for, Grace interjected smoothly, stepping forward with a pouch that clinked with coins. $100, Mr. Simmons. Surely that's worth interrupting your meal. Peter's eyes widened at the sight of the money. Grace could see him calculating, weighing whatever arrangement he had with Randall Hayes against the immediate cash being offered. Apparently cash won. I suppose, if it's an emergency, he hedged. But there will be processing fees, late penalties, all of which we're prepared to pay, Jack said. Right now, tonight, with witnesses if necessary. 20 minutes later, they had a receipt showing the water rights renewal had been filed and accepted, dated that very evening. Peter had tried to insist the process would take days, but the combination of Jack's unwavering presence and Grace's calm recitation of territorial law regarding emergency filings had convinced him to complete everything immediately. As they walked back to their horses, Grace felt Jack's hand briefly touch her shoulder. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. The money, the courage to face Randall, knowing the law well enough to back Peter into a corner. I couldn't have done this without you. Partners, Grace reminded him, echoing his earlier words. That's what we do. They stayed at the boarding house that night rather than risk riding home in the dark. Jack insisted on paying for separate rooms, and as Grace lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the town's night sounds, she thought about how much had changed in just a month. She'd come to this territory as property being sold to cover someone else's debts. Now she was a partner in a ranch, someone with a stake in something real. She'd stood up to a powerful man and won. She'd invested every penny she had in a future she was helping to build. And most surprisingly, she'd found someone who saw her not as too much, but as exactly enough. The next morning, they rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence. But as they crested the final hill and the homestead came into view, Grace felt her chest tighten with something she was almost afraid to name. This was home now. Not just a place she worked, but home. The first real home she'd had since her parents died. And she would fight to keep it, whatever came next. The confrontation with Randall Hayes changed something fundamental between Grace and Jack. Where before they'd worked together with cautious respect, now they moved as a unit, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with glances and gestures as much as words, building a partnership that went deeper than contracts or wages. Grace caught herself thinking of the ranch as ours instead of his, and Jack had taken to asking her opinion on decisions he'd once made alone. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the horizon. The work continued relentlessly, but Grace found herself thriving under it. Her body, which had always been treated as a burden, was finally being used for what it was built for. She could hoist fence posts Jack struggled with, carry loads that would have required two men, work through the afternoon heat when others would have sought shade. And Jack never looked at her strength with anything but gratitude and admiration. 2 months into her time at the ranch, Jack kept his promise about making the place fit her. He'd been quietly observing, she realized, taking note of the small ways the house and furniture weren't built for someone her size. One evening, she came in from checking the cattle to find him in the main room, surrounded by tools and lumber. "What are you doing?" she asked, eyeing the half-assembled chair frame with curiosity. "Making you something that won't break," Jack replied without looking up from his work. He was carefully fitting joints together, his hands moving with practiced precision. "I've watched you perch on the edge of chairs like you're afraid they'll collapse. Watched you hunch over the table because it's too low. You shouldn't have to make yourself smaller just to exist in this house." Grace felt that now familiar tightness in her chest, the one that appeared whenever Jack treated her humanity as self-evident. "You don't have to—" "I want to," Jack interrupted gently. "Besides, I'm building two. One for you, one for me. Seems foolish to make furniture that can't actually hold the people who live here." He glanced up at her, squinting against the lamplight. "I measured one of the chairs that broke under you, rated for maybe 150 pounds at most. What kind of fool builds furniture that can't handle real people?" "Most furniture makers assume women are delicate," Grace offered, settling carefully onto her usual spot at the edge of the sofa. "Then most furniture makers are idiots," Jack declared. "My wife was small, maybe 5'2" and thin as a rail. But she could haul water and chop wood and break a horse when needed. Delicate wasn't in her vocabulary." His hand stilled on the wood, and Grace saw grief flicker across his face before he pushed it down and continued working. Size doesn't determine strength, and strength isn't something to apologize for. Grace watched him work in silence for a while, thinking about his wife. The woman in the photograph with the kind eyes and gentle smile. The woman who'd made a home in this place, who'd loved this complicated, decent man and left him bereft when fever took her. She wondered what it must be like to be mourned with such devotion, to be remembered with such tenderness years after death. "What was her name?" Grace asked quietly. "Your wife?" Jack's hands paused again, but this time he didn't look up. "Elizabeth, Beth for short. She hated her full name, said it was too fancy for a ranch woman." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Our daughter was Emma, 3 years old when the fever came through. She looked just like her mother, same dark hair, same blue eyes, same stubborn chin." "I'm sorry," Grace said, meaning it. "That you lost them, that you've been alone." "Me too," Jack replied simply. Then he did look up, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But I'm not alone anymore, am I? You're here, and that matters more than I think you know." Before Grace could respond, before she could untangle the knot of emotions his words created, Jack returned to his work. But the air between them had shifted somehow, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. The chairs were finished 3 days later, and they were magnificent. Solid oak construction, joints reinforced with careful joinery, seats wide enough to be comfortable, backs high enough to provide real support. Jack had even carved subtle details into the wood. Nothing fancy, just clean lines that suggested craftsmanship and care. "Go on," he urged, gesturing at one of the chairs. "Test it." Grace approached cautiously, running her hand over the smooth wood. Then she sat, slowly at first, testing whether it would hold. The chair didn't creak, didn't shift, didn't give even the slightest suggestion of weakness. She settled her full weight onto it, and it felt solid as the earth beneath her feet. "It fits," she said, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "It actually fits me." "That's the idea," Jack replied, satisfaction clear in his tone. He sat in the other chair, leaning back to test it. "No more perching on edges. No more making yourself smaller. These chairs are built for people who work hard and need proper rest." That evening, they sat in their new chairs by the fire, though the summer heat hardly required it, and talked about plans for the ranch. The cattle would need to be moved to the south pasture in another week. The barn repairs were nearly complete, but the roof would need attention before winter. There was talk of buying a few more horses, maybe taking on some breeding stock if they had a good year. We could expand, Jack said thoughtfully, staring into the low flames. Not to Randall Hayes's level. I've got no interest in empire building, but we could run 300 head comfortably with the pastures we've got. Maybe 400 if we're smart about rotation. That would require more help, Grace pointed out. Maybe hiring on a hand or two for the busy seasons. True, Jack acknowledged. But I've been thinking about that. If we have a good year, if the market holds, we could afford it. Build up the bunkhouse properly, make it livable, hire people we trust. He glanced at her. People you approve of. This is your place too now, Grace. I won't bring anyone onto this property you're not comfortable with. Grace felt the weight of that statement, the trust it implied. He was giving her veto power over who worked here, who shared this space, acknowledging that her safety, her comfort, her judgment mattered as much as his own. We'll figure it out together, she said, when the time comes. But the time came sooner than either of them expected, and in a way neither could have anticipated. 3 weeks later, Grace was in the barn repairing tack when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. She set down the bridle she'd been working on and moved to the door, instinctively positioning herself where she could see but remain in shadow. 5 riders came into the yard, and even from a distance Grace could see they weren't friendly visitors. They wore the kind of rough clothes that suggested men who did dirty work for money, and the way they sat their horses, loose and confident and armed, made her stomach clench with dread. Jack emerged from the house, and Grace saw him take in the situation with the same sick recognition she felt. His hand moved toward his hip, where she knew he kept a revolver when trouble threatened. The lead rider was a man she didn't recognize, but Jack clearly did. "Garrett," Jack said flatly, "didn't expect to see you this far north." "Jobs go where the money is," Garrett replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was perhaps 40, with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, and the kind of casual menace that came from years of violence. "And Mr. Hayes pays well for problem solving." "I don't have a problem," Jack said carefully. "And neither does Randall Hayes, unless he's creating one where none exists." Garrett laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "See, that's where you're wrong. Mr. Hayes has a problem. He wants this land, and you keep refusing to sell. That's a problem." He leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting on his gun. "Now, we can solve this problem easy or hard. Easy is you sign over the deed and walk away with your life and enough money to start over somewhere else. Hard is—" He shrugged. "Well, hard involves fire. Accidents happen on ranches all the time. Barn catches fire, spreads to the house. Maybe the stock gets spooked and tramples a stubborn rancher who got caught in the wrong place. Maybe the stock gets spooked and tramples a stubborn rancher who got caught in the wrong place." Grace felt cold rage settle over her like a familiar coat. This was beyond pressure or intimidation. This was a direct threat of murder, dressed up in euphemisms about accidents. "You're threatening to burn my property and kill me unless I sell," Jack said, his voice eerily calm. "That's what you're saying." "I'm saying accidents happen," Garrett corrected. "But they happen less often when people make smart choices. So what's it going to be, Mercer? Smart or stubborn?" Grace stepped out of the barn before she'd consciously decided to move. All 5 riders' attention snapped to her, and she saw surprise flicker across several faces. They'd clearly expected Jack to be alone. "There's a problem with your plan," Grace said, her voice carrying across the yard with the kind of authority that came from years of being underestimated. "You're trespassing on private property, making terrorist threats, and conspiracy to commit arson and murder. That's enough to get you hanged in any territorial court." Garrett's eyes narrowed, assessing her. "And who might you be?" "Grace Dalton, partner in this ranch and witness to every word you just said." She took several steps forward, positioning herself beside Jack in a statement of unity. "Which means you can leave now and hope we don't report this to the sheriff. Or you can try to follow through on your threats and deal with 2 defenders instead of 1. One of the other riders, younger than Garrett and clearly nervous, shifted in his saddle. "Boss, she's got a point. If there's a witness—" "Shut up, Tommy," Garrett snapped. Then to Grace, "You think you can stop 5 armed men, woman? You and 1 rancher against professionals?" "I think," Grace said coldly, "that you're counting on fear and intimidation rather than actual violence." Because violence leaves evidence: bodies, burned buildings, investigations. And Randall Hayes didn't get rich by being stupid. He sent you here to scare us, not to actually start a war. She crossed her arms, making herself as large and immovable as possible. So no, I don't think you'll do anything. I think you'll ride back to Hayes and tell him we're not scared, we're not selling, and the next person he sends to threaten us will be met with the sheriff instead of words. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, and Grace could see him calculating. Could see him realizing she was right, that Hayes wanted them gone, but not in a way that would bring federal marshals and murder investigations. Could see him realizing that two witnesses were exponentially more problematic than one. "You're making a mistake," he finally said, but there was less conviction in it now. "Both of you. Hayes gets what he wants eventually, always has." "Then he'll be disappointed this time," Jack said, finding his voice again. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Grace in a protective gesture she'd have found insulting from anyone else. "We're not selling, not to Hayes, not to you, not to anyone. This ranch is our home and we'll defend it, with lawyers if we can, with guns if we have to. Your choice, which?" The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, and Grace could feel violence hovering in the air like heat lightning, potential energy waiting for an excuse to discharge. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression calm, kept her body language confident. Bullies, she reminded herself. Just better armed bullies. Finally, Garrett yanked his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he said, but it sounded like what it was, a retreat disguised as a threat. "Hayes always gets what he wants. Remember that when your luck runs out." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Grace and Jack stood frozen until the sound of hoofbeats faded into distance. Then Jack turned to her, his face pale beneath his tan. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Grace, those men could have killed us both." "They could have," Grace agreed, feeling the adrenaline start to fade and leave her trembling. "But they didn't, because they're hired guns working for a man who wants to stay respectable. Hayes can't afford to be connected to murder. Not when we've already been to the county offices, filed official paperwork, put ourselves on record as resisting his pressure." Jack ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of pure stress. "You're probably right. But Grace, if you'd been wrong—" "I wasn't," Grace said firmly, though part of her wondered if she'd just been incredibly lucky rather than smart. "But we need to be prepared. Hayes will try something else. Maybe not violence, but something. We need witnesses, documentation, people who know what's happening here. The sheriff," Jack said suddenly. "Tom Brennan, over in Clearwater. He's honest, not in Hayes's pocket. We should ride over tomorrow, file a formal complaint." "And then what?" Grace asked. "Hope the law protects us? Hope Hayes gives up?" "And then we work," Jack said, his expression hardening into determination. "We make this ranch so successful, so established, so visible that Hayes can't touch us without everyone knowing. We build alliances with other ranchers, make ourselves valuable to the community. We survive until Hayes realizes we're more trouble than we're worth." Grace nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in it. They couldn't fight Hayes head on. He had too much money, too much influence. But they could make themselves too difficult to dislodge quietly, too connected to eliminate without consequences. "Then we'd better get to work," she said. The next morning, they rode to Clearwater and filed a formal complaint with Sheriff Brennan, a grizzled man in his 50s who listened to their story with grim attention. He took notes, had them sign statements, and promised to look into it, though Grace could see the resignation in his eyes. One sheriff against Randall Hayes' resources wasn't much of a match. But it was documentation, it was evidence, it was their names on official record, making them harder to quietly disappear. They spent the ride home in thoughtful silence, both of them processing what had happened, what it meant for their future. As they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Grace felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. This place, these buildings, this land, it was theirs. Theirs to defend, theirs to build, theirs to love, and she would be damned if Randall Hayes took it from them. The weeks that followed were tense, both of them jumping at every unexpected sound, every rider on the horizon. But the threatened violence never materialized. Hayes was playing a longer game, Grace realized. waiting for them to fail on their own, waiting for winter or drought or bad luck to do his work for him. So they worked harder. Jack taught Grace everything he knew about ranching, how to read the weather, how to predict when a cow would calve, how to spot disease before it spread through the herd. Grace, in turn, shared what she knew about making do with little, about stretching resources, about finding creative solutions when money was tight. They sold a dozen head of cattle at market and used the profits to buy supplies for winter, feed, tools, materials for repairs they couldn't put off any longer. Grace insisted they save a portion too, building a reserve against emergencies. Jack had wanted to spend it all on immediate needs, but Grace's years of scarcity had taught her the value of a cushion against disaster. "What if one of us gets hurt?" she argued. "What if we need to hire temporary help? What if there's a hard winter and we need extra feed? We can't spend every penny we make." Jack had conceded the point, and they'd put $20 aside in a tin box hidden under a floorboard in Jack's room. It wasn't much, but it was something. A buffer. A beginning. As summer gave way to early fall, Grace realized she'd been at the ranch for nearly 4 months. 4 months of sunrise mornings and exhausted evenings, of calloused hands and aching muscles, of building something real with someone who treated her like an equal. 4 months of being valued instead of tolerated, of being seen instead of dismissed. 4 months of being home. One evening, after a particularly long day of moving cattle to fresh pasture, Grace and Jack sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The air had that golden quality particular to early autumn, and there was the faintest hint of coolness creeping in as shadows lengthened. "I've been thinking," Jack said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what you said before, about hiring help. I think we should do it. Not now, but come spring. Find someone trustworthy, bring them on for the busy season." "That's a good idea," Grace agreed. "Someone young, maybe, willing to learn. We could train them right, teach them to do things properly instead of just fast." "I was thinking the same thing," Jack said. He hesitated, then continued, "I've also been thinking about profit sharing. You put up $100 to save this place. You've worked as hard as any 3 men. When we sell stock in the spring, you deserve more than just wages. You deserve a percentage." Grace turned to look at him, surprised. "Jack, you already pay me fair wages. You don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Jack interrupted. "Because you're not just hired help, Grace. You're a partner, a real partner, not just someone I say nice things to while keeping all the profits. If this ranch succeeds, you should benefit proportionally." He met her eyes, his expression serious. 20% of profits after expenses. "That's what I'm proposing. We shake on it, we honor it, and we build this place into something we can both be proud of." Grace felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. 20%. After years of working herself to the bone for scraps, for the privilege of not starving, for shelter that came with constant criticism, here was a man offering her a real stake in something. Not charity, not pity, partnership. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice rough. "Say yes," Jack replied simply. "Say you'll stay, that you'll keep building this with me, that you'll make this place as much yours as mine." Grace extended her hand, and Jack took it in his own. They shook once, firmly, sealing an agreement that went far beyond money or legal ownership. They were building something together, not just a ranch, but a future, a home, a place where both of them belonged. "Yes," Grace said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes to all of it." The first frost came in late September, painting the grass silver and reminding them that winter was coming. They spent days preparing, checking the barn's integrity, ensuring the stock had adequate shelter, laying in supplies for the lean months ahead. Grace had never prepared for winter with adequate resources before, and the simple act of stocking the pantry with enough food to actually last felt almost decadent. "Is this too much?" she asked Jack one afternoon, looking at the shelves lined with preserved vegetables, smoked meat, flour, sugar, coffee. Jack glanced at what she was indicating and shook his head. "That's exactly right. Maybe even a bit light. We need enough for us, plus extra in case we get snowed in, plus emergency supplies if something goes wrong." He added another sack of beans to the shelf. "My first winter alone after Beth and Emma died, I ran out of coffee in January. Thought I'd go mad before the thaw." What did you do? Grace asked. Went 2 months without, Jack replied with a grimace. Then rode 8 miles through snow to the nearest neighbor to beg for supplies. Swore I'd never let myself get caught short again. He paused, then added quietly, That was a bad winter. Not just the coffee, the loneliness, the cold, the endless days with no one to talk to. There were times I wondered if I'd make it to spring. Grace felt her heart clench at the image of Jack alone in this house, fighting not just the weather, but despair. But you did, she said softly. You made it. I did, Jack agreed. And this winter will be different. We'll have enough supplies, enough wood, enough company. We'll make it through together. Together. The word wrapped around Grace like a blanket, warm and secure. She wasn't facing winter alone in a house where she wasn't wanted, scraping by on inadequate food and no heat. She was facing it as a partner, as someone with resources and agency, and a person who cared whether she survived. Together, she repeated, making it a promise. As October deepened, the ranch settled into the rhythm of preparing for the hard months. They cut firewood until their arms ached, stacking cords against the house where they'd stay dry. They reinforced the barn against wind and snow. They checked and rechecked every fence line, every shelter, every potential weak point. And through it all, Grace found herself watching Jack with new eyes. Noticing the way he moved with quiet competence, the way his hands were gentle with the animals, the way he looked at the land with love and determination. Noticing how his face had lost some of its gauntness as regular meals and shared labor rebuilt his strength. Noticing how he smiled more now, how laughter came easier, how the grief that had defined him was slowly being balanced by something else. She caught him watching her too sometimes, caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something warmer than gratitude, deeper than friendship, more complex than simple partnership. It made her heart skip in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Grace had never considered herself someone who might be loved romantically. Her size, her strength, her very existence seemed designed to put her outside the category of women who got courted and married. She'd made peace with that years ago, or thought she had. But Jack looked at her sometimes like she was exactly what he'd been searching for. Like her strength was desirable, not disqualifying. Like she was just right instead of too much. And Grace found herself wondering in the quiet moments before sleep what it might mean if that look in his eyes was what she thought it was. Found herself hoping and fearing in equal measure. One evening in mid-October, they were working in the barn when Grace climbed up to the loft to check the hay stores. The floor, recently repaired, felt solid beneath her feet as she walked among the stacked bales, counting and assessing quality. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice the plank that had worked slightly loose until she stepped on it. The wood gave way with a crack like thunder. Grace felt herself falling, felt the sickening lurch of empty air beneath her feet. She reached out instinctively, grabbing for anything, and her hand found a support beam. She caught it, held on, her body swinging out over the 15-foot drop to the barn floor below. "Grace!" Jack's voice, sharp with terror. Grace's fingers scrabbled for purchase on the smooth wood, her other hand swinging up to grab the beam. Her shoulders screamed with the effort of holding her full weight suspended, but she managed to get both hands secured. "Don't move!" Jack was already climbing the ladder to the loft, moving faster than was safe. "Just hold on, I'm coming!" Grace held on, her arms burning, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Below her, she could see the hard-packed dirt of the barn floor, could imagine the damage that fall would do. Broken bones at minimum. Maybe worse. Jack reached the loft and dropped flat on his stomach, reaching out toward her. "Can you swing toward me?" he asked, his voice tight with fear but controlled. "I think so," Grace managed. She took a breath, then used what remaining strength she had to swing her body toward Jack's outstretched arms. Once, twice, 3 times, and on the third swing, Jack's hands closed around her wrists. "I've got you," he said, his grip like iron. "Don't let go of the beam yet. On 3, I'll pull and you push up. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Together they hauled Grace up and over the edge of the loft floor. She rolled onto solid planking, her heart hammering, her whole body shaking with delayed terror and adrenaline. Jack gathered her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Grace, you could have died. You could have—" "But I didn't," Grace said, her own voice shaky. She became aware that Jack was trembling as badly as she was, that his face was pressed against her hair, that his arms around her felt like the only solid thing in a spinning world. They stayed like that for a long moment, clutching each other on the loft floor, both of them processing how close they'd come to disaster, how quickly everything could change, how fragile and precious this life they were building really was. When Jack finally pulled back enough to look at her face, Grace saw raw emotion in his eyes, fear, relief, and something else. Something that made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with her recent brush with death. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I need you to know you matter. To this place, yes, but also to me. You matter to me. The thought of losing you, of you falling, of this ranch continuing without you in it." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I can't go back to being alone. I won't survive it a second time." Grace's heart was doing strange things in her chest, beating out a rhythm she'd never felt before. "Jack, You don't have to say anything," Jack interrupted quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know I'm still grieving Beth and Emma, that maybe I shouldn't feel that it's too soon or too fast or too—" He stopped again, clearly struggling. "I just needed you to know. You're not just a partner or hired help or even a friend. You're important. You're important to me." Grace looked at this man who'd saved her from an auction block, who'd treated her with respect when others saw only burden, who'd built her a chair that fit and offered her a future and just pulled her back from a potentially fatal fall. This man who was looking at her like she was precious, like she was irreplaceable, like she was exactly right. "You're important to me too," she said quietly. "More than I knew how to say. More than I thought I could feel." Jack's eyes searched hers, looking for something. Permission, maybe, or confirmation. Whatever he found there must have been enough, because he leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Grace didn't pull away. His lips touched hers gently, tentatively, a question more than a declaration. Grace answered by closing the remaining distance between them, by kissing him back with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. It was nothing like she'd imagined kissing would be. It was better, warmer, more real. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not going to apologize for that," he said. "Even if I should." "Don't," Grace replied. "Don't apologize. Don't overthink. Just let this be what it is." What it was, Grace realized as they climbed down from the loft, and Jack insisted on examining every inch of her for injuries, was the beginning of something she'd never thought she'd have. Not just partnership or friendship, but something deeper. Something that felt like the word she'd been afraid to even think. Love. They didn't talk about the kiss that night, but something had shifted between them. Jack found excuses to touch her. A hand on her shoulder as they passed, fingers brushing as they reached for the same tool, standing just a little closer than strictly necessary. And Grace, who'd spent her whole life making herself smaller and taking up less space, found herself leaning into those touches instead of away from them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation and growing awareness. Winter was coming. They could feel it in the air, see it in the way the cattle clustered together, taste it in the sharpness of each morning's frost. But underneath the urgency of getting ready, underneath the hard work and long hours, something was blooming between Grace and Jack that felt as inevitable as the changing seasons. They were building more than a ranch. They were building a life. Together. And for the first time in as long as Grace could remember, the future felt like something to look forward to rather than something to survive. Winter arrived in earnest the second week of November, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that seemed personal. The first real storm hit just after dawn, turning the world white in a matter of hours. Grace stood at the kitchen window watching the snow fall in thick, heavy curtains, thinking about how different this winter would be from every other one she'd endured. Jack came up behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. "Deadly, but beautiful." "We're ready for it," Grace replied, thinking of the full pantry, the stacked firewood, the reinforced barn. "For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of winter." Jack's hand found hers. their fingers intertwining with the ease of something they'd been doing far longer than a few weeks. "We'll make it through together," he said, echoing the promise they'd made to each other in the fall. "Whatever comes." Ding. The storm lasted 3 days, dumping enough snow to make travel impossible and transforming the ranch into an isolated kingdom of white. Grace and Jack worked together to keep the stock fed and watered, trudging through drifts that came up to Grace's thighs and Jack's waist. The cattle huddled in the barn and the reinforced shelters they'd built, mostly content to wait out the weather with hay and patience. On the third night, exhausted from battling the elements all day, they collapsed in front of the fire. Jack had made stew from preserved vegetables and salt pork, and they ate in comfortable silence, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been here," Jack said eventually, staring into his bowl. "If I'd been trying to manage all this alone, I'd have lost stock for sure, maybe gotten caught in a drift and frozen. Being alone in weather like this is death waiting to happen." What? Grace set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. "But I am here, and you're not alone. Not anymore." Jack met her eyes, and in the firelight, Grace saw everything he felt written plainly on his face. Love, gratitude, hope, fear of losing what they were building. It was a mirror of her own heart, and it terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Grace," Jack started, then seemed to lose his nerve. He looked away, jaw working as he tried to find words. "This thing between us, this, whatever it is we're building, it's not just partnership anymore, is it?" "No," Grace said quietly. "It's not." "I don't want to rush you," Jack continued, still not quite meeting her eyes. "I know your life before this was hard. I know you probably have reasons to be cautious, to protect yourself. And I'm still grieving Beth and Emma, still figuring out how to live with that loss. But Grace, when I look at you, I see—" He stopped, finally turning to face her. "I see tomorrow. I see a future. I see home." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was something precious to be cherished rather than a burden to be managed. "I see the same thing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent my whole life being told I was too much, too big, too strong, too hungry, too difficult. And then you came along and looked at me like I was exactly right, like I was exactly what you needed." "Because you are," Jack said fiercely, reaching out to take both her hands in his. "Grace, you saved this ranch. You saved me. I was drowning before you got here, going through the motions but already half dead inside. You brought life back to this place. You brought me back to life." Grace leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully. "I never thought I'd have this. Someone who wanted me, who looked at me with anything other than disdain or pity or disgust. I made peace with being alone, with being unwanted. And now that I have you, now that I have this, I'm terrified of losing it." Jack's arms came around her, pulling her close. "You won't lose it," he promised. "You won't lose me. I'm not going anywhere, Grace. This is real, what we have. It's solid." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the storm raged outside and the fire crackled beside them. Grace let herself feel safe in a way she never had before. Not just physically safe, but emotionally. Safe to hope. Safe to want. Safe to love. When they finally pulled apart, Jack cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "I'm going to court you properly," he announced, a hint of determination in his voice that made Grace smile. "I know we're past some of the usual steps, what with living in the same house and running a ranch together, but I'm going to do this right. You deserve that." "Jack, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "You deserve flowers and compliments, and someone making an effort to win your heart, even if maybe they've already won it. You deserve all the things other women get, all the romance and attention and care. You deserve to be courted." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. "No one's ever courted me before." "Then I'll be the first," Jack said simply, "and if I have my way, the last." The storm broke the next morning, leaving the world transformed. The sun came out bright and blinding on the snow, and the temperature dropped so low that every breath felt like inhaling knives. But inside the house, something had shifted. Jack was true to his word about courting Grace, though his gestures were necessarily limited by circumstance and isolation. He brought her coffee in bed every morning, insisted she take the more comfortable chair by the fire, found excuses to compliment her throughout the day. He carved her name into the wooden handle of a new pitchfork, claiming she needed tools that were properly hers. He taught her to play chess in the evenings, patient with her initial confusion and delighted when she started winning games through sheer strategic thinking. And Grace, unused to being the object of anyone's affection, found herself blossoming under the attention. She caught herself humming while she worked, smiling at private thoughts, feeling lighter than she had in years. She started taking more care with her appearance, brushing her hair smooth instead of just yanking it back, washing her face with the good soap Jack had bought for himself but insisted she use. They moved through the house like dancers learning a new routine, finding a rhythm that worked for both of them. Sometimes Grace would look up from whatever she was doing to find Jack watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her breath catch. Sometimes Jack would turn around to find Grace studying him with a small smile playing at her lips. They were falling in love, both of them knew it, and neither was fighting it anymore. But winter on a ranch didn't allow for much time to simply exist in romantic bliss. The work continued relentlessly, stock needed constant attention, water had to be kept from freezing, fences needed checking after every storm. They worked side by side as they had since Grace arrived, but now there was an added dimension to their partnership. Now when Jack helped Grace up after she'd fallen in the snow, his hands lingered. Now when they passed each other in the narrow hallway, one or both would pause for a quick kiss or touch. In late November, nearly a week after the first major storm, Jack made the trip into Clearwater for supplies. He asked Grace to come along, but she declined, wanting to use the day to tackle some indoor projects that had been put off. She watched him ride out on his gelding, leading a pack horse for supplies, and felt an unfamiliar pang of anxiety at his departure. This is what love feels like, she realized, worrying about someone, missing them even though they've only been gone an hour, counting the hours until they return. She threw herself into work to distract herself, scrubbing floors that didn't really need scrubbing, organizing tools that were already organized, making bread even though they still had plenty. She was kneading dough when she heard horses approaching and felt her heart lift. Jack was back early. But when she looked out the window, her heart sank. 3 riders, and none of them were Jack. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, positioning herself between the riders and the house. She recognized 2 of them from Garrett's crew months ago, but the third was new, younger, maybe 18, with nervous eyes that kept darting around the property. "Jack's not here," Grace called out before any of them could speak. "You're wasting your time." The older of the 2 men she recognized, a lean man with graying hair called Silas, smiled without humor. "Heard he rode to town. Heard you were here alone. Thought we'd take the opportunity to have a chat." "We have nothing to chat about," Grace replied coolly. "And you're trespassing. Again." "See, that's where you're wrong," Silas said, dismounting with casual confidence that set Grace's teeth on edge. "Mr. Hayes sent us with a message, a generous message, considering how stubborn you and Mercer have been." "Not interested," Grace said flatly. "You haven't heard the offer yet," Silas continued, taking a step closer. Grace held her ground. "Mr. Hayes is willing to double his previous offer for this property. That's more money than a ranch hand and a broken-down cowboy would see in 10 lifetimes. All you have to do is convince Mercer to take it. And if we don't?" Silas's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Then Mr. Hayes will be very disappointed. And when Mr. Hayes is disappointed, bad things tend to happen. Accidents, misfortunes. You understand?" Grace felt cold fury settle over her, the same fury she'd felt months ago when these men first threatened their home. "I understand that you're threatening us," she said clearly. "Again, despite being told that we've documented everything with the sheriff, despite knowing that witnesses exist, despite basic human decency suggesting you leave people alone." "Human decency doesn't pay the bills," Silas replied, "and witnesses don't matter much if they're not around to testify." It was the threat under the threat, the suggestion that they could simply be eliminated if they continued to resist. Grace saw the young rider shift uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly bothered by how far this was going. You need to leave, Grace said, her voice dropping into a register that surprised even her. Deep, authoritative, absolutely unyielding. Right now, before Jack gets back and we have a situation none of us want. 1 woman against 3 men? Silas laughed. I'll take those odds. He took another step forward, and Grace moved without thinking. She grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the porch railing, the one Jack had carved her name into, and leveled it at Silas's chest with the kind of competence that came from years of farm work. Stop, she commanded. Don't take another step. Silas paused, reassessing. Maybe he'd expected her to run, to cower, to be easily intimidated. But Grace had spent her entire life being underestimated, and she was done backing down. You really want to threaten me with farm equipment? Silas asked, though he'd stopped advancing. I really want you off our property, Grace replied. But if you insist on staying, if you insist on threatening us, then yes, I will defend our home with whatever's at hand. She adjusted her grip on the pitchfork, making sure he could see she knew how to use it. I've spent my whole life being told I'm too big, too strong, too much. You want to find out exactly how much too much I can be? For a long moment, they stared at each other, Silas calculating whether she'd actually use the weapon, Grace radiating a willingness to do exactly that. The other 2 riders had gone very still, clearly not expecting this development. Then a voice rang out from the road. I'd listen to the lady if I were you. Everyone turned to see Jack riding hard toward the ranch, and he wasn't alone. Sheriff Brennan rode beside him, along with 2 deputies Grace didn't recognize. They thundered into the yard in a cloud of snow and hoofbeats, and Grace felt relief so intense it made her knees weak. Jack dismounted while his horse was still moving, positioning himself beside Grace with his own rifle in hand. Gentlemen, he said coldly, the sheriff would like a word. Sheriff Brennan stayed mounted, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene. Silas Walker, he said, recognition clear in his voice. Thought we had an understanding after that incident over in Carbon County. Thought you'd learn to stay away from law-abiding citizens. Just delivering a message, Sheriff, Silas said, trying for innocent and missing by a mile. No harm intended. No harm? Grace spoke up, her voice sharp. He threatened us. Again. Said that if we don't sell to Hayes, bad things would happen. Said witnesses don't matter if they're not around to testify. That's conspiracy to commit murder, Sheriff. That's a threat against our lives. Sheriff Brennan's expression hardened. That true, Silas? You threatening these folks? Just business conversation, Silas hedged. Maybe the lady misunderstood. I understood perfectly, Grace interrupted. And I'm not the only witness. Your young friend there heard everything too. She pointed at the nervous 18-year-old. Didn't you? The young man's face had gone pale. He looked between Silas and the sheriff, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. He said we were just supposed to scare them. But then he started talking about witnesses disappearing, and I don't want any part of that. I needed the money, but I ain't no murderer. Tommy, shut your mouth, Silas hissed. No, sir, Tommy replied, his voice shaking but determined. My mama didn't raise me to be part of killing innocent folks. I'm done. He looked at the sheriff. I'll testify to everything I heard, if that helps. Sheriff Brennan nodded slowly. Appreciate that, son. Now, Silas Walker, I'm placing you under arrest for making terrorist threats, trespassing, and conspiracy. Your friends there can ride out peacefully, or they can join you in a cell. Their choice. The second rider, who hadn't said a word the entire time, immediately wheeled his horse around and took off at a gallop. Tommy dismounted, clearly choosing to cooperate, and Silas, seeing his options narrow to nothing, slowly raised his hands. Hayes will hear about this, Silas said as one of the deputies moved to restrain him. He won't let this stand. Mr. Hayes can file a complaint through proper channels, Sheriff Brennan replied. But unless he wants to end up in the cell next to you, he'll think twice about sending more thugs to threaten people on their own property. He looked at Jack and Grace. You two willing to press charges and testify in court? Absolutely, Jack said without hesitation. Every word, Grace added. They spent the next hour giving detailed statements to the sheriff, with Tommy corroborating everything. The young man, it turned out, had been hired just 2 weeks ago with promises of legitimate ranch work. He'd had no idea he was being recruited for intimidation and worse. I'm sorry, Tommy said to Grace as he prepared to ride out with the sheriff, for coming here, for being part of this. It ain't right what Hayes is trying to do. You did the right thing in the end, Grace replied. That takes courage. Don't forget that. After the sheriff and his prisoners rode off, Jack and Grace stood in the yard watching them disappear into the distance. Then Jack turned to her, his expression cycling through relief, anger, and fear in rapid succession. When I came over that ridge and saw 3 men in our yard, saw you holding them off with a pitchfork. His voice broke slightly. Grace, you could have been killed. They could have done anything. But they didn't, Grace said, setting down the pitchfork finally. I held them off until you arrived with the cavalry. We protected our home, together, even when we were apart. Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it almost hurt. I should have been here. I should have... You were exactly where you needed to be, Grace interrupted, pulling back enough to look at his face. Jack, how did you know? How did you happen to bring the sheriff back at exactly the right moment? Jack's expression turned grim. I didn't just go for supplies. I went because I heard rumors in town. Hayes's men asking questions about our routine, about when we'd be vulnerable. I went straight to the sheriff, told him I thought Hayes was planning something. Brennan agreed to ride back with me just to check. We got lucky with timing. Not luck, Grace said firmly. Preparation. You saw a threat and acted on it. We both did. She touched his face gently. We're going to be okay, Jack. Hayes made a mistake sending those men with a witness who actually had a conscience. Now there's an arrest on record, testimony, official documentation of harassment. He can't touch us now without exposing himself. You really think it's over? Jack asked, sounding like he didn't dare hope. I think we won this round, Grace replied carefully. And I think Hayes is smart enough to know when to cut his losses. He's a businessman. Bad publicity, court cases, arrested employees, that's bad for business. He'll move on to easier targets. Jack studied her face, then smiled despite everything. You're incredible. You know that? Most women would be terrified after something like this. You're analyzing strategy and predicting outcomes. Most women haven't spent their lives fighting for every scrap of dignity and survival, Grace pointed out. I learned a long time ago that fear is a luxury I can't afford. Action is better. They stood together in the cold, holding each other, processing what had happened and what it meant. The threat wasn't completely gone. Randall Hayes was still powerful, still ambitious, still coveting their land. But the balance had shifted. They had documentation, witnesses, arrests. They had the law on their side now, imperfect as it was, and more importantly, they had each other. That night, after a subdued dinner and hours of restless energy they couldn't quite shake, Jack and Grace sat by the fire again. But this time, there was an urgency between them that hadn't existed before, coming so close to violence, to loss, to the fragility of everything they'd built. It had stripped away the last of their hesitation. Marry me, Jack said suddenly, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back and couldn't anymore. I know it's fast. I know we've only been building this for a few months. But Grace, marry me. Make this official. Make us official. Grace felt her heart stop, then start again in double time. Jack, I love you, he continued, the words seeming to pour out of him now that he'd started. I love your strength and your courage and your stubbornness. I love how you face down armed men with a pitchfork. I love how you sing when you think I can't hear you. I love how you look at this ranch like it's something worth fighting for. I love how you make me want to be better, do better, build something worthy of you. He took her hands in his. I loved Beth, and I'll always carry her and Emma in my heart. But I love you too, Grace. Differently, but just as truly. And I don't want to waste another day not being married to you. Grace felt tears streaming down her face, not caring that she was crying in front of him. I love you too, she said, her voice breaking. I never thought anyone would want me, would see me as something other than a burden. But you look at me like I'm precious, like I'm exactly what you need, and I look at you the same way. Is that a yes? Jack asked, hope and fear warring in his expression. Yes, Grace said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. Jack kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We'll do it properly," he said. "Ride to town, get the license, have Sheriff Brennan perform the ceremony. Make it legal and official and real." "When?" Grace asked. "Soon as the weather clears enough to travel," Jack replied. "I don't want to wait. Don't want to give the universe any more chances to take this away from me." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about the future with an excitement neither had felt in years. They'd get married, continue building the ranch, maybe even start a family if fate allowed. They'd face whatever challenges came, together, always together. As Grace lay in bed that night, her last night as an unmarried woman in her own small room, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From an auction block where she'd been sold like livestock to a ranch where she was valued and loved. From being told she was too much to finding someone who thought she was exactly right. The world outside was harsh and cold, and often cruel. Randall Hayes was still out there, still powerful, still potentially dangerous. Winter was far from over, and spring would bring its own challenges. Nothing was guaranteed, and life remained fragile and uncertain. But Grace had something now she'd never had before. She had love. She had partnership. She had a home worth defending and a future worth building. She had Jack, and Jack had her, and together they were strong enough to face whatever came next. 2 days later, during a brief break in the weather, Jack and Grace rode to Clearwater. They got the marriage license from a flustered clerk who couldn't quite hide his surprise at the match. This weathered rancher and this tall, strong woman who looked at each other like they'd discovered something precious. Sheriff Brennan performed the ceremony in his office with his wife as witness, a simple affair that took maybe 10 minutes but felt like stepping into an entirely new life. Grace wore her best dress, the one Jack had bought her during their last trip to town, and Jack wore his Sunday clothes that still smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where they'd been stored. "Do you, Jack Mercer, take Grace Dalton to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Sheriff Brennan asked. "I do," Jack said, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Grace Dalton, take Jack Mercer to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Grace replied, her voice strong despite the emotions churning inside her. "Then by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife, and, Jack, you may kiss your bride." Jack cupped Grace's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, like she was made of something precious that might break. Grace kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it: love, gratitude, hope, determination. When they pulled apart, Sheriff Brennan was smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. May you have many happy years together." Mrs. Mercer. Grace Mercer. She had a new name now, a new identity that wasn't defined by what she was too much of, but by who she'd chosen to build a life with. They rode home as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Grace kept looking at the simple gold band on her finger, Jack's mother's ring, he'd told her, kept all these years for exactly this purpose, and marveling at how much her life had changed. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked as they neared the ranch. "I'm thinking," Grace said slowly, "that 6 months ago I was standing on an auction block being sold for a bag of flour, and now I'm married to a man I love, riding home to a ranch I own half of, with a future that actually looks bright." She turned to him, smiling despite the cold. "I'm thinking that sometimes miracles happen when you least expect them." "You're the miracle," Jack said softly. "You saved this ranch, Grace. You saved me. Everything good that's happened since the day I carried you out of that town square traces back to you." "We saved each other," Grace corrected. "That's what partners do." They reached the ranch as full dark was falling, both of them tired from the journey but filled with a contentment that went bone deep. This was their home now, officially and legally. They were building something real here, something that would last. As they settled the horses and prepared for another cold night, Grace found herself looking forward to the future with an emotion she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope. Whatever came next, whether it was Randall Hayes' continued interference, the challenges of ranching, the unpredictable hardships of frontier life, they would face it together. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, partners in every sense of the word. And that, Grace thought as she and Jack walked toward their house hand in hand, was worth more than any amount of money or land or safety. That was worth everything. Winter settled into the kind of deep cold that made the world feel frozen in time. Grace woke on her first morning as Mrs. Mercer to find Jack already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. He turned when he heard her stirring, and the smile that lit his face made her heart skip. "Morning, wife," he said, testing out the word like it was made of something precious. "Morning, husband," Grace replied, finding she liked the sound of it just as much. They fell into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of days. The intimacy they'd been building for months now had permission to fully exist, and Grace discovered that being loved by Jack Mercer was even better than she'd imagined. He was gentle with her in ways that made her throat tight, patient with her inexperience, and worshipful of her body in a way that gradually erased years of shame about her size. "You're beautiful," he told her one night, tracing the line of her shoulder with his fingertips. "Every inch of you. I don't understand how anyone ever made you feel otherwise." "They were afraid," Grace said, finally understanding something she'd never quite grasped before. People fear what they don't understand, and they didn't understand how a woman could be strong and tall and still be a woman. "But you've never been afraid of me." "Because there's nothing to be afraid of," Jack replied simply. "Except maybe losing you. That terrifies me." Grace pulled him closer, wrapping her arms around him. "You won't lose me. I'm not going anywhere." But the world, as they both knew, had other plans. The storm that had been building in the mountains for days finally broke in mid-December, hitting with a ferocity that shocked even Jack, who'd lived through decades of Wyoming winters. The wind howled like something alive and furious, driving snow so thick they couldn't see the barn from the house. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in minutes, and breathing the outside air felt like inhaling glass. "We need to check the stock," Jack said on the second day of the storm, already pulling on layers of clothing. "They'll be in the shelters, but we need to make sure." "I'm coming with you," Grace said, not making it a question. Jack looked like he wanted to argue, to protect her from the brutal conditions, but he knew better. They were partners, and partners didn't leave each other to face danger alone. "Stay close," he said instead. "In a whiteout like this, you can get lost 10 feet from the house." They roped themselves together at the waist, a precaution that felt excessive until they stepped outside and were immediately engulfed in a world of white. The wind tore at their clothes, tried to steal their breath, and the cold bit through every layer with vicious intensity. Grace had never experienced anything like it, and she'd lived through hard winters before. They made it to the barn by following the guide rope Jack had strung months ago for exactly this purpose. Inside, the cattle were huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. Grace and Jack worked quickly, breaking ice in water troughs, distributing hay, checking each animal for signs of frostbite or distress. "They're holding up better than I expected," Jack shouted over the wind that was somehow audible even inside the barn. "The reinforcements we made are working." They were on their way back to the house, fighting through drifts and wind, when Grace heard something that made her stop. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, high-pitched, desperate, barely audible over the howling wind. "Jack, wait!" She tugged on the rope between them. "Do you hear that?" Jack paused, listening. For a moment there was nothing but wind, and then it came again. A cry that sounded almost human, but higher, weaker. "Animal," Jack said. "Something's caught out in this." They shouldn't investigate. They should get back to the house before the storm got worse, before they used up what little reserves of warmth and energy they had left. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. Grace was already moving toward the sound. They found her 20 yards from the barn, nearly buried in a snowdrift. A young woman, maybe 16 or 17, wearing clothes that were completely inadequate for the weather. She was curled in on herself, her lips blue, her skin pale as the snow around her. Grace didn't think, just acted. She scooped the girl up in her arms, shocked by how light she was, how cold. "House!" Grace shouted to Jack. "Now!" They ran, as much as anyone could run through waist-deep snow, Grace carrying the girl and Jack breaking trail. The guide rope led them true, and they burst through the door of the house in a shower of snow and wind, slamming it shut behind them against the storm's fury. Grace laid the girl on the rug in front of the fire while Jack threw more wood on the flames. The girl was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin dangerously cold to the touch. Grace had seen hypothermia before, knew they had minutes, not hours, to act. "We need to warm her up, but slowly," Grace said, already stripping off the girl's frozen outer clothes. "Too fast and we could kill her. Jack, get blankets. And warm water, not hot." They worked together with the efficiency of people who'd learned to anticipate each other's needs. Jack brought blankets and prepared warm water while Grace got the girl out of her frozen clothes and into dry underlayers from Grace's own dresser. They wrapped her in blankets, fed her tiny sips of warm water when she began to stir, and gradually brought her body temperature up. It took hours. Hours of monitoring her breathing, checking her extremities for frostbite, making sure she didn't slip back into unconsciousness. The storm raged on outside, trapping them all in the house, but Grace barely noticed. All her focus was on this fragile life they'd pulled from the snow. Finally, as evening approached, the girl opened her eyes fully. They were green, Grace noticed, and filled with confusion and fear. "Where?" the girl started, her voice a rasp. "You're safe," Grace said gently, holding a cup of warm broth to her lips. "You're in our home. I'm Grace Mercer, and this is my husband Jack. We found you in the storm." The girl drank the broth slowly, her eyes moving between Grace and Jack like she was trying to determine if they were threats. "I was running," she finally said. From him. Mr. Hayes." Grace and Jack exchanged a look. Of course this connected back to Randall Hayes. "Take your time," Jack said, settling into a chair nearby. "Tell us what happened." The story came out in pieces, fragmentary and difficult, but the picture it painted was ugly. The girl's name was Molly Carson. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving debts that Randall Hayes had bought up. Hayes had offered to forgive the debts in exchange for Molly coming to work in his household, except the work he'd wanted wasn't cooking or cleaning. When Molly had refused his advances, Hayes had told her mother that the debts would be called in, that they'd lose everything unless Molly cooperated. "I couldn't do it," Molly said, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't let him, so I ran, stole a horse and just rode. I didn't know where I was going. The storm hit and the horse threw me, ran off. I thought I was going to die out there." Grace felt fury rising in her chest, cold and focused. Hayes wasn't just a greedy businessman trying to consolidate property. He was a predator, using his power to hurt vulnerable people, first trying to destroy their ranch, now this. How many other people had he hurt? How many other victims were too afraid to speak? "You're safe here," Grace said firmly. "Hayes can't touch you here. You can stay as long as you need." "But my mother," Molly said desperately. "He'll hurt her. He'll take everything she has left." "We'll handle it," Jack said, his voice hard as iron. "Hayes has gone too far this time. We'll handle it." The storm lasted 2 more days, trapping them all in the house. Grace and Jack cared for Molly, who slowly regained her strength but remained terrified that Hayes would somehow find her. Grace understood that fear, had felt it herself. But she also understood something else. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to expose them publicly, to make their crimes too visible to ignore. When the storm finally broke and the world emerged white and glittering and bitterly cold, Jack rode to Clearwater to fetch Sheriff Brennan. Grace stayed with Molly, and during those hours alone together, they talked. Grace shared her own story. The auction block, Jack's rescue, the building of a life from nothing. Molly listened with something like hope dawning in her eyes. "You really think we can stop him?" Molly asked. "A man as powerful as Hayes?" "I think powerful men can be brought down if enough people are willing to speak truth," Grace replied. "You're not alone in this, Molly. You have us. And I suspect once people hear your story, once they understand what Hayes really is, you'll have even more support." Jack returned with Sheriff Brennan and another man Grace didn't recognize, a journalist from the territorial newspaper, gaunt and intense with ink-stained fingers. Jack had been thinking several steps ahead, Grace realized. It wasn't enough to arrest Hayes or file charges. They needed to destroy his reputation, make him radioactive in business and social circles. Molly told her story again, this time with the journalist taking notes and the sheriff recording an official statement. She was shaking by the end of it, but her voice never wavered. This was courage, Grace thought, not the absence of fear, but action despite it. "There are others," Molly said quietly. "Other girls Hayes pressured, other families he's destroyed, but they're all too scared to speak. He has so much power. Not anymore, the journalist said, his pencil moving rapidly across his notepad. This story runs in tomorrow's edition. By the end of the week, everyone in the territory will know what kind of man Randall Hayes really is. Sheriff Brennan nodded grimly. And I'll be riding out to his ranch today with a warrant for his arrest. Attempted coercion, sexual exploitation, abuse of power. Between Miss Carson's testimony and the previous incidents with you folks, we've got enough to make charges stick. They all rode out together the next morning, Jack, Grace, Sheriff Brennan, 2 deputies, and the journalist. Molly stayed behind, too fragile still for the confrontation, but her testimony went with them in the form of official documents and sworn statements. The Hayes Ranch was everything the Mercer Ranch wasn't: ostentatious, sprawling, decorated with wealth acquired through exploitation. Randall Hayes himself stood on his porch watching them approach, and even from a distance Grace could see the rage in his bearing. "Sheriff," Hayes said coldly as they dismounted, "to what do I owe this invasion of my property?" "Randall Hayes, you're under arrest," Sheriff Brennan replied, pulling out the warrant. "Charges include attempted coercion, sexual exploitation of a minor, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit various crimes against the Mercers. You can come quietly or in chains. Your choice." Hayes's face cycled through emotions: shock, rage, calculation. "This is absurd," he said, but there was a tremor in his voice. "You can't prove any of this. It's the word of a runaway girl against a respected businessman." "It's the word of multiple witnesses," the journalist interrupted, stepping forward, "including documented threats against the Mercers, an arrested employee who testified against you, and now Miss Carson's detailed account of your attempted assault. I have 3 other families willing to speak on record about your business practices. By tomorrow morning, everyone in the territory will know exactly who Randall Hayes is." Grace watched Hayes's expression crumble as he realized his carefully constructed empire was collapsing. All his power, all his influence, all his wealth, none of it could stand against the simple act of people refusing to be silent anymore. "You," Hayes said, his eyes landing on Grace with pure venom. "This is your fault. You and that broken-down rancher. If you just sold when I asked—" "If we'd sold, you'd still be hurting people," Grace replied calmly. "Just different people. The problem was never us, Hayes. It was always you. Your greed, your cruelty, your belief that power gave you the right to destroy anyone in your way." Hayes lunged toward her, rage overtaking sense, but Jack stepped between them and 2 deputies grabbed Hayes's arms. He struggled, shouting threats and curses, as they wrestled him toward a horse. "Everything you've built will fall apart," Hayes screamed at Grace and Jack. "Your ranch will fail. You'll lose everything. We'll be fine," Jack said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "Because we have something you never understood. We have each other. We have community. We have people who trust us. You had fear and money, and you thought that was enough. But it never was." They watched as Sheriff Brennan and his deputies rode off with Hayes in custody, the man's shouts fading into the distance. The journalist was already scribbling notes, crafting the story that would destroy whatever remained of Hayes's reputation. Grace felt Jack's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "It's really over," she said softly. "He can't hurt us anymore." "It's over," Jack agreed. "Now we can finally just live. Just build our life without looking over our shoulders." They rode back to the ranch slowly, both of them processing what had happened, what it meant. When they crested the hill and saw their home spread out below them, the house with smoke curling from the chimney, the barn standing strong, the land white and beautiful in the winter sun, Grace felt something shift inside her chest. This was theirs, truly, completely theirs. No threats hanging over them, no powerful men trying to take it away. Just their home, their future, their life to build however they chose. Molly was waiting for them on the porch, bundled in borrowed clothes, her face anxious. When she saw their expressions, relief flooded her features. "It's done?" she asked. "It's done," Grace confirmed. "Hayes is in custody. Your testimony helped put him there. You're safe now, Molly. You're free." The girl crumpled, months of fear and tension releasing in a flood of tears. Grace held her while she cried. This fragile life they'd saved, this girl who'd had the courage to run, and the luck to run toward people who would help rather than hurt. "What will I do now?" Molly asked when she'd cried herself out. "I can't go back to town. Everyone knows what Hayes tried to do. They'll talk. They'll say it was my fault." "You can stay here," Jack said, before Grace could make the same offer. "If you want, we could use the help come spring, and you need somewhere safe to land. We'll pay fair wages, same as we'd pay anyone. And when you're ready to figure out what comes next, we'll help you do that too." Molly stared at them both like they'd offered her the world. "You'd do that? For me?" "Why wouldn't we?" Grace asked gently. "You're not the first person to need a second chance, Molly. We believe in second chances here." Over the next few weeks, as winter continued to grip the land, their household found a new rhythm. Molly proved herself eager to learn and willing to work, though she was still rebuilding her strength. Grace taught her ranch work, how to care for stock, how to mend tack, how to read the weather. Jack taught her to ride properly and handle tools. And slowly, day by day, the terrified girl who'd stumbled into their lives began transforming into someone stronger. The story about Hayes broke in the territorial newspaper exactly as promised, and the fallout was immediate and devastating for the man who tried to build an empire on fear and exploitation. Other victims came forward, emboldened by Molly's courage. Hayes's business partners abandoned him. His political connections severed ties. By the time his trial came around in early spring, he was already a broken man facing a long prison sentence. But at the Mercer Ranch, life was blooming. With the worst of the threats behind them and spring approaching, Grace and Jack began to dream bigger. They talked about expanding the herd, about building a proper bunkhouse for seasonal workers, about maybe starting a breeding program for horses. They talked about the future with the kind of joy that came from knowing it was actually theirs to plan. One evening in late March, as the snow was finally beginning to melt and the first hints of green were showing on the south-facing slopes, Jack found Grace standing in the yard looking at the land with an expression he'd come to know well. It was the look she got when she was planning, dreaming, building castles in her mind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking," Grace said slowly, leaning back against him, "about how far we've come. How much has changed in less than a year." "Everything has changed," Jack replied, resting his chin on top of her head. "You changed everything." "We changed everything," Grace corrected. "Together." They stood like that for a while, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere in the barn, Molly was singing to herself as she finished evening chores. The cattle were peaceful in their pasture. The house behind them was warm and welcoming, no longer a place of grief and loneliness, but a home filled with life and love. "Jack," Grace said softly, "I'm pregnant." She felt him go completely still behind her, his breath catching. Then he turned her around to face him, his eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure," Grace replied, placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "About 2 months along, I think. I wanted to be certain before I told you." Jack's eyes filled with tears, and Grace watched emotions chase across his face: joy, terror, grief for the family he'd lost, hope for the family they were building. "Grace," he said, his voice breaking, "a baby. We're having a baby." "We are," Grace confirmed, her own eyes stinging. "Sometime in the fall, best I can figure. Is this okay? I know it's fast. I know you're still—" Jack kissed her, cutting off her anxious words, pouring everything he felt into it. When he pulled back, he was smiling through tears. "It's more than okay," he said. "It's perfect. You're perfect. This life we're building is perfect." He placed his hand over hers, over the place where their child was growing. "Beth and Emma will always be part of me. But this baby, this future, this is mine to cherish and protect and love. And I do. God, Grace, I love you so much." "I love you too," Grace whispered, letting herself be held, letting herself believe in this impossible future. The news spread quickly. To Molly first, who cried happy tears and immediately started planning how she could help with the baby, and then gradually to the neighbors and friends they'd accumulated over the months. People they'd helped during difficult times, people who'd benefited from Jack and Grace's generosity, people who saw in their success a model for how life should be lived. The Harvest Festival in September was the biggest the territory had seen in years, and Jack and Grace were at the center of it all. Grace was heavily pregnant by then, her belly round and full, her body once again proving its strength by carrying new life with ease. She'd been nervous about appearing in public so obviously pregnant, worried about judgment and whispers, but instead she found celebration. People congratulated them, blessed the coming child, shared their own stories of parenthood and community. Grace realized that somewhere along the way, without quite noticing when it happened, she'd become respected. Not despite her size or her strength, but because of it. People knew her story. The auction block, the partnership with Jack, the confrontation with Hayes, the rescue of Molly Carson. She'd become something like a folk hero, proof that the undervalued and discarded could rise and thrive. As the festival music started and lanterns were lit against the gathering dusk, Jack approached Grace with a small box in his hand. "I made you something," he said, suddenly shy despite months of marriage, "for tonight." Grace opened the box to find a silver arm cuff, beautifully worked with intricate designs that depicted their story. A mountain, a barn, a woman standing strong. It was craftsmanship of the highest order, and Grace knew Jack must have been working on it for months. "Jack, it's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed metalwork. "You were never too big," Jack said, sliding the cuff onto her arm where it fit perfectly. "You were always just right for me, for this life, for everything." He turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the festival grounds. "This is my wife, Grace Mercer. She saved my ranch. She saved my life. And she taught me that strength comes in forms we don't always expect. She taught this whole community that people deserve second chances, that courage matters more than circumstances, and that standing up to bullies is the only way to defeat them." The crowd cheered, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face. These were her people now. This was her community. She belonged here, not because someone had decided to tolerate her, but because she'd earned her place through work and courage and refusing to be diminished. "Dance with me," Jack said, holding out his hand. Grace took it, and they moved on to the makeshift dance floor. Other couples joined them. Molly, with a young ranch hand who'd been courting her cautiously for months. Sheriff Brennan with his wife, neighbors and friends, and the people who'd become their extended family. As Grace danced beneath the lanterns, her husband's arms around her, their child moving within her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From an auction block where she'd been sold for the price of flour to this moment of complete and utter belonging. She thought about all the people who'd told her she was too much, too big, too strong, too difficult. She thought about the years of making herself smaller, of apologizing for existing, of believing she deserved whatever scraps of kindness anyone was willing to throw her way. And she realized that every single person who'd told her she was too much had been wrong. She wasn't too much. She was exactly enough. Exactly right. Exactly what the world needed, even when the world didn't know it yet. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, noticing her faraway expression. "I'm thinking," Grace said, smiling up at him, "that I'm glad that Cowboy picked me up and told me I was just right for his arms." Jack laughed, the sound full of joy and love. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "and I'd make it again every single day for the rest of my life." They danced until the music faded and the lanterns burned low, until their child protested the movement with kicks and rolls, until the night air turned cold enough to drive them home. They rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Molly dozing on the wagon seat beside them, all of them tired and happy and full of hope for tomorrow. When they reached the house, their home, their sanctuary, Grace paused before going inside. She looked at the barn standing strong against the night sky, at the land stretching out around them, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. "Thank you," she said softly to Jack, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me." "Thank you," Jack replied, "for being exactly who you are, for being strong enough to survive until we found each other, for building this life with me." They went inside together, into the warmth and light, into the home they'd created, into the future they were building one day at a time. Behind them, the Wyoming night settled over the land, cold and beautiful and full of promise. Grace Mercer, who'd once been sold for a bag of flour, who'd been told she was too much her entire life, had found her place in the world. Not by making herself smaller, but by finding someone who saw her strength as beautiful. Not by accepting less, but by demanding exactly what she deserved. And in a house on a ranch in Wyoming, surrounded by love and laughter and the promise of new life, Grace finally understood what it meant to be home. She was exactly right. She always had been. It had just taken finding the right place, the right person, and the right moment for